For more than 70 decades, the public watched Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II present an image of quiet, steadfast partnership. Two people who had weathered war, the pressures of monarchy, and the relentless glare of public life side by side. So when, in his final years, Philip made the decision to no longer share a home with his wife, it caught many royal watchers off guard. Was it simply a desire for peace and independence in old age? A quiet rift the palace never fully explained? Or something more complicated that built up over a marriage spanning most of the 20th century? To understand it, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a chance meeting decades before either of them held any real power, and to a relationship that would be shaped as much by duty as by love. A royal romance begins. Long before Philip and Elizabeth became one of the most photographed couples on Earth, they were simply two distant cousins whose paths crossed almost by accident. Their first meeting came in 1934, at a family wedding. She was a child of 8. He was a 13-year-old naval cadet with royal Greek blood, but, following his family's exile, no throne of his own to look forward to. By most accounts, nothing about that first meeting hinted at what was to come. They were simply two young relatives among a crowd of adults. It took another 5 years for fate to bring them together again. In 1939, Princess Elizabeth, then 13, traveled with her parents and younger sister Margaret to visit the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. The itinerary that day had originally called for a formal chapel service, but an outbreak of illness among the cadets forced a change of plans. Instead, the royal party spent the afternoon at the headmaster's house, and 18-year-old Philip, one of the few cadets not affected by the outbreak, was tasked with keeping the young princesses entertained. Restless indoors, Philip led them out to the grounds, vaulting over tennis nets and showing off on the croquet lawn with an easy, carefree athleticism. It was a small moment, but by Elizabeth's own later account, it left a lasting impression. She would say she never had eyes for anyone after that day. A correspondence between the two began not long after, and throughout the war years, while Philip served with the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters, Elizabeth reportedly kept a photograph of him close by, a private symbol of her growing attachment. By 1946, with the war behind him, Philip returned home and his relationship with Elizabeth had clearly deepened into something serious. That June, he proposed to her on the grounds of Balmoral. In a letter he wrote around that time, he reflected on having survived the war and lived to see peace, and on how falling completely in love afterward made even the weight of the world's troubles feel small by comparison. Not everyone welcomed the match. King George VI, Elizabeth's father, was hesitant. He worried her daughter was too young, too inexperienced in matters of the heart, and that she might be settling for the first serious suitor she had known. There was also a degree of quiet snobbery circulating among royal circles at the time. Despite Philip's own genuine royal lineage, he and Elizabeth were in fact third cousins as direct descendants of Queen Victoria. Some in the aristocracy viewed him as too foreign, too blunt-spoken, and altogether too unpolished to be a fitting match for the future Queen of England. Elizabeth, however, was not easily swayed. She had made up her mind, and the family kept quiet about the engagement while she waited out the doubts. It wasn't until a year later, after Elizabeth turned 21, that the engagement was formally announced. In preparation for the wedding, Philip gave up his Greek and Danish royal titles entirely, converted from Greek Orthodoxy to the Church of England, and adopted the anglicized surname Mountbatten, taken from his mother's family. On the 20th of November, 1947, the couple married at Westminster Abbey in a ceremony that drew crowds despite the austerity of post-war Britain. They honeymooned at Broadlands in Hampshire, the country home of Philip's uncle, Earl Mountbatten. For a brief window afterward, life felt almost ordinary. Philip resumed his naval career, advancing steadily through the ranks, while the young couple welcomed their first 2 children, Charles, born in 1948, and Anne, born the following year. Stationed for a time in Malta, Philip and Elizabeth experienced something close to a normal military family's existence, with Elizabeth occasionally traveling to join him, while the children remained in England. It was, by several accounts, one of the happiest periods of their marriage, free of the full weight of the crown that was still, at that point, resting on someone else's shoulders. A crown changes everything. That normality ended abruptly in 1952 when King George VI died suddenly of illness. Philip and Elizabeth were on a royal tour in Kenya at the time, and it fell to Philip to inform his wife that her father had died and that she was now queen. Elizabeth, only 25, immediately understood what was expected of her, and the couple returned to Britain at once. For Philip, then 30, the transition was jarring in ways few could fully appreciate. He had built a promising naval career and had every expectation of continuing to rise through the ranks, ambitions he now had to set aside entirely to support his wife's reign. For a man used to commanding at sea, being placed in a position with no clear authority of his own was a difficult adjustment. It was made harder still by the era itself. In the 1950s, it was almost unthinkable for a husband to be formally subordinate to his wife, let alone one whose job, as queen, was considered to take precedence over virtually everything else, including family life. He was given the title Duke of Edinburgh, and later Prince, but never king consort, instead functioning informally as royal consort, a role with no real precedent in modern British history. The lack of clarity frustrated him. He later admitted that when he asked exactly what was expected of him in this new position, he was often met with blank stares. Nobody quite knew. Compounding the difficulty was a dispute that struck directly at his sense of identity. Philip's uncle, Lord Mountbatten, floated the idea that the royal house should be known as the House of Mountbatten, given that Elizabeth had married into that family. Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister, along with Elizabeth's grandmother, Queen Mary, firmly rejected the suggestion, insisting the House of Windsor continue unbroken, honoring her father's legacy. Philip was reportedly furious at being denied even this. He was said to have remarked bitterly that he felt like nothing more than a bloody amoeba, the only man in the country not permitted to pass his own name on to his children. Sympathetic to his frustration, Elizabeth later issued a declaration in 1960 that descendants without royal titles would carry the surname Mountbatten-Windsor, a compromise that acknowledged, at least symbolically, his place in the family line. Despite these early struggles, Philip described his years finding his Slidim as consort as a process of trial and error, without any playbook to follow. He embraced the role as best he could, channeling much of his restless energy into modernizing an institution he feared could otherwise ossify into little more than a museum piece, cut off from the public it was meant to represent. He pushed hard, against real resistance from traditionalists within the household, for Elizabeth's coronation to be televised, arguing it would be a disservice to present such a historic moment as though it were some private theatrical performance. His instinct proved right. More than 20 million viewers tuned in, marking one of the first times the monarchy had been made genuinely visible to ordinary people rather than experienced through official portraits and formal announcements. Philip went on to become the first member of the royal family to sit for a televised interview, and roughly a decade later encouraged the family to allow cameras into their private lives for a behind-the-scenes documentary, an unprecedented level of access at the time. He also encouraged the Queen to begin televising her annual Christmas message, personally teaching her to use a teleprompter, and reportedly became the first royal to adopt computers, using one for his own correspondence and speeches well before it was common practice. Beyond broadcasting, he pushed to end the outdated tradition of formally presenting debutantes at court and introduced more informal garden parties and lunches designed to bring the monarchy into contact with a broader cross-section of British society. He also took a hands-on role in reorganizing and renovating royal estates, generally working to loosen some of the rigid formality that had defined palace life for generations. With considerably more free time than his official duties required, Philip pursued an unusually wide range of personal interests. By the 1980s, he had authored 9 books on subjects ranging from wildlife conservation to design and technology. He took up painting, favoring watercolors, and was an avid reader who gravitated towards history over fiction. Elizabeth, for her part, made consistent efforts to include him in her public life, often opening speeches with the now famous phrase, "My husband and I," a line so frequently repeated it became something of an affectionate national joke. Yet Philip was never merely a figurehead standing beside his wife. Within family matters, Elizabeth reportedly deferred to him and let him take the lead, while in matters of state, he had no formal say whatsoever, a divide that must have been difficult to navigate day to day. Occasionally, glimpses of a far more ordinary marital dynamic slipped into public view. On one occasion, while driving Elizabeth to Cowes for a sailing event, his fast driving reportedly made her visibly tense, prompting him to snap that he'd put her out of the car if she kept reacting that way. Though she was, after all, the reigning monarch, she reportedly composed herself rather than press the point. Other accounts describe moments when she asserted herself just as firmly, even in front of household staff, occasionally telling him bluntly to be quiet. Moments that, by some tellings, sent him storming out of the room in frustration. Like any long marriage, theirs held both warmth and friction in equal measure. Rumors of infidelity also trailed Philip for much of his adult life, fueled largely by his famously flirtatious personality, his membership in various gentlemen's clubs, and his frequent voyages aboard the royal yacht Britannia during the 1950s. Over the years, gossip linked him to a number of women, including a Russian ballerina, an English stage actress, and a writer, though none of these alleged affairs was ever substantiated. At one point, a British tabloid published a story alleging Philip had been meeting a woman regularly at a West End apartment. The palace flatly denied any truth to the story and dismissed suggestions of marital trouble. Philip himself tended to respond to such rumors with dry humor, once asking pointedly whether anyone had ever actually seen him go anywhere without a police escort in tow, a not-so-subtle reminder of just how closely his movements were monitored. Royal biographer Sarah Bradford offered a different reading, suggesting that after an earlier brush with scandal in the 1950s, Philip had simply become far more discreet, keeping any indiscretions confined to elite social circles, well insulated from tabloid scrutiny. Whatever the truth, no infidelity was ever conclusively proven, and what remained most visible to the public over the decades was his consistent devotion to his wife. At their golden wedding anniversary, Elizabeth publicly described him as her strength and stay throughout the years, words she repeated, in various forms, at their diamond and platinum anniversaries as well. The retirement years. Then, in 2017, after more than 70 years of marriage, came a genuine turning point. Philip and Elizabeth began living largely apart. That May, Buckingham Palace announced his retirement from public duties, though he didn't complete his final official engagement, a farewell appearance with the Royal Marines, until early August at the age of 96. The palace's statement made clear he would no longer carry out public engagements on his own, though he might occasionally appear at events alongside the Queen, something that in practice happened only rarely. Following his retirement, Philip relocated from Buckingham Palace to Wood Farm, a modest house on the Sandringham estate, a considerable distance, both physically and symbolically, from the pomp of central London. The house itself carried a quiet, somewhat somber history. It had once been home to Prince John, the youngest son of King George V, who suffered from epilepsy and spent his short life there in seclusion with a devoted nurse before dying at just 13 in 1919. Philip had spoken as early as 2011, at 90, about simply wanting time to enjoy himself, though it would be another 7 years before he actually followed through. By most accounts, Elizabeth supported his decision fully, well aware of how much he had sacrificed over the decades and sympathetic to his desire for a slower pace. There was, apparently, some irony in how that desire played out in practice. When Philip arrived at Wood Farm hoping for something simple, he reportedly found a substantial retinue of cooks, telephone operators, and household staff already waiting for him, hardly the quiet retreat he'd envisioned. Still, he made the best of it, embracing a version of retirement suited to his own interests. At Sandringham, he took up carriage driving after arthritis in his wrists made polo, a lifelong passion, impossible to continue. The new hobby offered him a sense of freedom and control, though he eventually had to give it up as well, once his grip on the reins weakened with age. He filled much of his remaining time with watercolor painting and reading, still favoring history over fiction, and enjoyed regular conversation with close friends. He also continued to drive himself around the private estate roads until January 2019, when he was involved in a car accident after his SUV flipped following a collision near Sandringham. Though shaken, the then 97-year-old walked away without serious injury, while the occupants of the other vehicle were hurt. Philip apologized publicly for the incident and 3 weeks later voluntarily surrendered his public driving license, though he retained the ability to drive on private estate roads and was photographed doing so at Windsor as late as April 2019. Despite living separately, the couple made a point of staying connected, speaking by phone daily, and with Elizabeth and other family members making regular visits out to Wood Farm to see him. Philip still emerged for major family occasions when he could, including the 2018 wedding of Princess Eugenie, one of his last significant public appearances. But as the years wore on, he increasingly lost touch with old friends and colleagues from his long life in public service. Within the span of about a year, he lost 3 close friends, along with his valet of some 40 years. Remarkably, Philip himself remained physically active and mentally sharp well into his late 90s, even as his short-term memory reportedly began to decline as he approached the milestone of turning 100. That milestone, notably, wasn't one he seemed eager to reach. By most accounts, he had little interest in the fuss and attention such a birthday would inevitably bring. Reunited by crisis. It ultimately took a global pandemic to bring the couple back under one roof for an extended stretch. When lockdown measures were announced across Britain in March 2020, Philip left Wood Farm to join Elizabeth at Windsor Castle, in an arrangement the household reportedly nicknamed HMS Bubble, a nod to Philip's naval background. The two stayed connected to the wider family throughout the lockdown, largely through video calls. That July, Philip made what would prove to be his final public appearance, stepping out into the quadrangle at Windsor to formally hand over one of his ceremonial military roles, Colonel-in-Chief of the Rifles, to the Duchess of Cornwall. It marked the last time he appeared before television cameras. By January 2021, both Philip and Elizabeth had received their COVID-19 vaccinations from a household doctor at Windsor. The following February, in February of that earlier year, Philip was admitted to King Edward VII Hospital for a precaution after feeling unwell, walking in unaided despite the public's concern for his well-being. The palace later confirmed he was being treated for an infection and subsequently underwent a successful heart procedure before being discharged and returning home. Attention soon turned toward his approaching 100th birthday, though there was a quiet sense among those close to him that he might not live to see it. That sense proved accurate. On the morning of April 9, 2021, Prince Philip died at the age of 99, with Elizabeth at his side. The palace described his passing as peaceful, and Elizabeth later remarked that his death had left an enormous void in her life. Philip was laid to rest on April 17, 2021, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, joining a long line of royals interred there across generations, including King George III. In keeping with royal tradition, his will was sealed, in this case for a minimum of 90 years, to protect the family's privacy, a decision that has fueled ongoing public speculation about its contents, though nothing has ever been confirmed or is likely to be for decades to come. Remembering Philip. In the aftermath of his death, tributes poured in from across the family. Princess Anne, often described as particularly close to her father, called him her teacher, supporter, and critic, expressing deep admiration for his ability to treat every individual he met with respect, regardless of their background or status. She also credited him with playing a vital role in helping her mother find the confidence to take the throne at such a young age, and spoke of aspiring to live up to his example of service. Prince Charles paid tribute to what he called 70 years of remarkable devotion to the Queen, to the family, to the country, and to the wider Commonwealth, praising his father's tireless energy and support of his mother throughout their marriage. Prince Andrew, for his part, remembered a father who genuinely cherished the time he was able to spend with his family away from the spotlight. About a year after Philip's death, Elizabeth spoke publicly of her enduring affection for Scotland, a place deeply woven into many of the happiest memories she and Philip had shared together over the decades, a subtle but telling acknowledgement of how much she continued to miss him. Though the final years of their marriage were spent largely under separate roofs, few who followed their story closely would dispute that Philip's devotion to his wife defined the greater part of his life. On September 8, 2022, roughly 17 months after Philip's death, Queen Elizabeth II died at the age of 96. She was laid to rest beside him at the King George VI Memorial Chapel, reuniting in death a couple whose partnership had shaped the modern British monarchy for the better part of a century. What's your take on Philip's decision to spend his final years living apart from the Queen? Do you think it really was about wanting independence in old age, or do you suspect there was more beneath the surface? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more royal history.